I'd been at the shop late, wrestling with a busted carburetor, when I decided to call it quits early. My hands still smelled of grease as I pulled into our driveway just past dusk. The house was dark, but a faint glow flickered from the garage. Odd, Lila never went in there. I grabbed my toolbox, figuring I'd tinker with that old Zenith radio I'd been restoring. But then I heard it. A low, gravelly laugh I hadn't heard in person since I was 12. My stomach twisted. I cracked the garage door and froze. There she was, my wife, Lila, giggling as she adjusted a camera tripod. And sprawled across my workbench, flexing in a faded singlet, was Ricky the Titan Malone, my childhood wrestling hero. They didn't see me. Lila snapped photos, directing him like some low-budget director. "Arch your back more," she cooed, and Ricky grinned, his oiled biceps gleaming under a cheap spotlight. This wasn't some clandestine affair caught mid-act. No, this was weirder. She was staging him like a living action figure, and he was eating it up. I slipped back into the shadows, heart pounding. Ricky Malone, the guy whose posters lined my bedroom walls, was in my garage, with my wife, posing. I wanted to barge in, demand answers, but my gut screamed to wait. Therefore, I stayed quiet, watching, as Lila adjusted his pose again, her hands lingering on his shoulders just a second too long. I didn't sleep that night. Lila came to bed hours later, smelling faintly of sweat and cologne, acting like nothing happened. I played dumb, asked how her day was. "Oh, just ran some errands," she said, too casual. But I couldn't shake the image of Ricky flexing on my workbench. Growing up, I'd spent hours rewinding his VHS matches. His piledriver finish was my gospel. Now he was here in my life, and not in a way I'd ever imagined. I needed to know why. So the next morning, while Lila showered, I snooped through her phone. Her search history was a goldmine: Ricky Malone comeback tour, Titan fan meetups, cheap wrestling venues near me. She'd been driving 2 hours every weekend to catch his washed-up gigs in dingy VFW halls. But then I found the kicker, a Venmo log. She'd sent him $200 last week, labeled photo props. My blood ran cold. That was our money, from the joint account I'd been padding for a new transmission. I thought she'd been visiting her sister. Therefore, I grabbed my keys. I had to see if this was a one-off or something bigger. That night, when she said she was meeting a friend, I followed her, tailing her little blue Civic down the highway, straight to Ricky's orbit. I was 10 when I first saw Ricky wrestle live. My granddad took me, his way of teaching me grit after my dad bailed. "That man's a machine," he'd said, pointing at Ricky slamming some jobber through a table. I'd mimic his moves in the backyard, dreaming of being unbreakable. But now, parked outside a rundown bar hosting Titan's Last Stand, I felt anything but strong. Lila slipped inside, and I waited, sipping lukewarm coffee, until she emerged an hour later with Ricky, laughing. I ducked low as they climbed into her car and peeled off. I didn't follow right away. I needed context, not just blind rage. Back home, I dug deeper, bank statements this time. Thousands gone over 6 months, siphoned to RM Productions. She wasn't just a fan. She was bankrolling him. But then Lila cornered me that night, all smiles. "You've been quiet," she said, fishing. I mumbled something about work, but she pressed. "I've been helping a friend with a project. It's paying off." Paying off? Our savings were hemorrhaging. Therefore, I lied back, said I trusted her. She relaxed, clueless I'd already decided. I'd confront her soon, but first, I'd figure out what she was really chasing with my money and my hero. A week later, I found the Polaroids. Lila was at book club, so I tore through her desk. Tucked in an envelope were a dozen shots. Her and Ricky, posed like some warped tribute to his glory days. Him in his old Titan gear, her adjusting his belt. Fawning. Not lovers, not quite, just performative, like she was his personal hype machine. One photo showed her pinning a fake medal on him, both beaming. My face burned. This was my wife playing stagehand to a has-been, using my cash to fuel his ego. But then I noticed something. Her handwriting on the back. Titan's return. Take 47. 47. This wasn't a fling, it was an obsession. I sat there, staring at the photos, my mind spinning like a radio dial hunting a signal. I'd spent years fixing broken things. Radios, cars, even our marriage when Lila lost her job. But this was beyond repair. Therefore, I stuffed the Polaroids back, grabbed a beer, and started planning. I wouldn't just catch her. I'd unravel her little fantasy. The next day, I called in sick, drove to the next town, and parked outside the motel where Ricky's tour had landed. I needed proof this wasn't a one-off stunt, and I needed to see how deep this rabbit hole went. The motel was a dive. Peeling paint, neon sign buzzing vacancy. I spotted Lila's car in the lot and waited, slouched in my truck. She emerged from room 12 with Ricky, hauling a duffel bag. I expected hushed whispers, stolen glances. But no. She set up that damn tripod again, barking orders as he posed in the parking lot, flexing for imaginary cameras. A couple of drunks stumbled by, laughing, and she shooed them off like a pro. Then it hit me. She was staging candid shots, faking paparazzi buzz to hype his comeback. My wife wasn't cheating in the usual sense. She was his delusional PR puppet. I almost laughed at how absurd it was. Almost. But then I saw her pull out a stack of cash. My cash, and hand it to him. He pocketed it without a word, and she beamed like she'd won the lottery. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I'd spent my life tuning static into clarity, but this signal was loud and ugly. She'd traded our future for his spotlight. Therefore, I drove home, mind racing. Confronting her now would be too easy. She'd lie, and I'd still be the fool. No, I'd break her world apart, piece by piece, starting with the one thing she worshipped, Ricky the Titan Malone. I've always had a knack for fixing things, old radios especially. There's something satisfying about turning static into a clear signal, finding the frequency beneath the noise. Sitting in my truck after watching Lila play paparazzi, I realized her little game with Ricky was just more static. But I could tune it out, better yet, I could break it. She thought she was clever, siphoning our savings for his comeback. Therefore, I decided to flip the script. If she worshipped Ricky's ego, I'd start there, plant a seed of doubt and watch it grow. The next day, I dug through Ricky's old wrestling forums, dusty corners of the internet where fans still argued about his prime. I created a burner account, Titan Truth 91, and posted a vague rumor. Heard Malone's got a new manager pulling strings. Wonder who's really in charge. It was subtle but enough to stir the pot. Then I waited. Lila came home that night, humming, oblivious. She rambled about big plans while I nodded, pretending to care. But inside, I was already tweaking the dial, imagining her face when Ricky started questioning her loyalty. This wasn't about confrontation yet, it was about control. Ricky's next show was in a crumbling gym an hour away. I drove out not to watch Lila this time, but to get close to him. I wore a faded cap and a fake name, Mike, and sidled up to him at the merch table after his match. Big fan since '98, I said, shaking his meaty hand. He grinned, all teeth and bravado, and I fed him a line. Heard you've got some new backers. That lady with the camera. She's got others on the hook? Huh. His smile faltered, just for a second. Bingo. I kept it casual, bought a signed photo, and left. But the seed was planted. On the drive home, I pictured him stewing, wondering if Lila was playing him too. She'd always been good at manipulating people, me included, but she underestimated how well I knew her game. Therefore, I turned up the heat. I posted more on the forum, Titan's manager scene with other washed-up vets. Diversifying her portfolio? The replies lit up. Fans speculating, some calling her a grifter. I leaned back in my chair, tweaking a radio knob, and smiled. Static was clearing, and her fantasy was about to crack. Lila started slipping. She came home late a few nights later, flustered, muttering about misunderstandings. I played the concerned husband. Everything okay? I asked, pouring her coffee. She waved it off, bragging instead. Ricky's getting buzz again. I'm making it happen, photo leaks, fan chatter. It's working. She thought I was clueless, too busy with my radios to notice the missing money or her lies. But I'd already synced my phone to hers. Every word she said was recorded now, including that smug confession about draining our account for the cause. I nodded, sipping my own coffee, while my mind raced. She was so proud of her scheme, so sure she'd outsmarted me. But then I checked the forum. Ricky had posted a cryptic rant. Loyalty matters. Some people need to remember that. Lila's phone buzzed nonstop after that, her face tightening with each text. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Therefore, I saved the recording and moved to the next step. She'd handed me a weapon, her own voice, and I'd use it to bury her. The signal was getting louder, and she had no idea I was turning it against her. I went full sabotage the next week. Using my burner account, I doctored some of Lila's Polaroids, nothing explicit, just enough to twist the narrative. Her pinning that fake medal on Ricky became obsessed fan stalks Titan. I uploaded them to the forum with a sob story. She won't leave him alone. Keeps showing up at gigs. The fans ate it up. By morning, her name, leaked from a careless caption, was trending locally. Friends texted her screenshots, asking if she was okay. She stormed around the house, blaming haters, while I tinkered with a radio, feigning concern. But then the fallout hit harder than I expected. Her sister called, furious, saying their mom saw the posts and thought Lila was unhinged. Lila snapped at me. Why aren't you mad about this? I shrugged. People are jerks online. Inside, I was grinning. Therefore, I pushed further. Sent an anonymous tip to a podunk sports blog. Ricky Malone's comeback derailed by crazy fan? The story spread, warped, and suddenly Lila wasn't his savior anymore. She was his liability. I tuned the radio to static, letting the chaos hum, knowing she'd feel the squeeze soon. The blog post blew up. By Friday, a local reporter was sniffing around Ricky's next gig. A strip mall parking lot with folding chairs. I tipped them off. Ask about his manager. She's got a wild story. I parked across the street, watching as Lila arrived. All business, setting up her tripod. Then the reporter showed, notebook out, questions flying. Ricky's face darkened as Lila stammered, trying to spin it. She's just a friend, he growled. But the damage was done. Spectators whispered, phones out, recording her meltdown. She came home that night, shaking, claiming jealous trolls were ruining everything. I offered a hug, hiding my smirk. But then she got a call. Ricky, yelling loud enough I could hear. You're making me look like a joke, he bellowed. She pleaded, but he hung up. Therefore, I saw my opening. Her dream was fracturing, and I'd widen the cracks. I drained the last $1,200 from our account, rerouting it to a new one she couldn't touch. She'd notice soon, and when she did, I'd be ready to watch her squirm. The signal was crystal clear now. Her downfall was mine to conduct. I'd parked my truck a block from that strip mall parking lot, the engine still ticking as I watched the chaos unfold. Ricky's voice boomed through Lila's phone. I could hear it even from this distance, sharp and accusatory, cutting through the hum of crickets and distant traffic. She stood there, tripod wobbling in her hands, as that reporter scribbled furiously, his pen scratching out her downfall. A handful of gawkers lingered, their phones up, capturing every flinch on her face. The sodium lights buzzed overhead, casting her in a sickly yellow glow, and I couldn't look away. I'd spent years hunched over radios, teasing clear signals out of static, and now I saw it. Her whole fantasy world was fraying at the edges. She'd poured our money, her pride, everything into propping up Ricky, the Titan Malone. My childhood hero turned washed-up has-been, and I just kicked the legs out from under it. But this wasn't the end, not yet. I shifted in my seat, the vinyl creaking, and ran a hand over my jaw. The image of her adjusting that camera in our garage flashed back. Her hands on his shoulders, his oiled biceps flexing like some grotesque parody of the posters I'd worshipped as a kid. Back then, I'd rewind his matches on our old VCR, the tape hissing as he slammed some jobber through a table. My granddad would nod from his recliner, pipe smoke curling, saying, "That's a man who knows how to finish a fight." I'd mimic those moves in the backyard, dreaming of being unbreakable. But now I was the one breaking things. Driving home, I replayed her voice from that recording I'd snagged. I'm making it happen. Photo leaks. Fan chatter. She'd been so smug, so sure I was too buried in my radios to notice the thousands she'd siphoned from our joint account. The garage smelled of oil and dust as I pulled in, the same spot where I'd caught them. My workbench was still there, cluttered with tools she'd shoved aside for Ricky's poses. I grabbed a screwdriver, twirling it in my hand, and stared at the half-finished Zenith radio I'd been restoring. Granddad always said a good mechanic doesn't just patch a break. He makes it stronger than before. I'd fix cars, appliances, even our marriage when Lila lost her job 2 years back, taking extra shifts while she moped. But this was beyond repair. Therefore, I set the screwdriver down and fired up my laptop. I'd already turned Ricky against her with whispers of betrayal. Those forum posts as Titan Truth 91 had him doubting her loyalty. Now I'd make her the villain everyone saw. I logged in and typed a new thread, caught Malone's manager, bragging about scamming him. Audio proof coming soon. I didn't drop the recording, not yet, but the tease lit a match. Fans swarmed it, replies piling up, demanding details, speculating wildly. I leaned back, tweaking the radio's dial until static crackled, letting the buzz build in my head. She'd come home soon, rattled, and I'd be waiting, calm as ever, ready to twist the knife deeper. Lila burst through the door an hour later, her hair a tangled mess, eyes bloodshot like she'd been crying or screaming. "It's falling apart," she muttered, pacing the kitchen, her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. I stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup I didn't plan to eat, the steam curling up past my face. "What's wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice soft, almost bored. She launched into it. Ricky's tantrum, how he'd stormed off after the reporter's questions, how someone's spreading lies online. Her hands flailed, knocking a spoon onto the counter, and I nodded, hiding the electric thrill pulsing through me. She thought this was random chaos, bad luck piling up, not my hands turning the dial. But then she grabbed her phone, tapped the banking app, and froze. "The account's empty," she whispered, scrolling frantically, her thumb smudging the screen. I drained the last $1,200 that morning, moved it to a new account under my name alone, one she couldn't touch. "Must be a glitch," I said, shrugging, turning back to the pot. She didn't buy it. Her eyes narrowed, darting over my face like she was trying to tune in a station she couldn't quite hear. I kept stirring, the wooden spoon scraping the bottom, while my pulse hammered. She didn't know the half of it yet. Earlier, I'd called the bank, voice steady, reporting suspicious activity. Those massive transfers to RM Productions she'd been sending Ricky. I'd played the worried husband, and they'd frozen her access pending review. Then, through a burner email, I'd tipped them off again, linking her to a potential scam operation. Legal threats were brewing. A letter was already in the mail, accusing her of fraud, demanding repayment or court. She'd see it soon, and I'd watch her squirm. Her phone buzzed. Another text, probably Ricky, but she ignored it, muttering about calling him back. "He's overreacting," she said, more to herself than me. I almost smirked. He wouldn't answer, I'd made sure of that. The forum was a wildfire now, fans tearing into her, calling her a grifter, a con artist. Someone had dug up her real name, Lila Marie Hensley, from a careless comment she'd left on Ricky's old fan page years back, too sloppy to delete. It was spreading, her identity pinned to every post I'd planted. Therefore, I let her pace, let her tap at her phone, her voice rising with every failed call. The soup bubbled, the burner hissed, and I tuned it all out, hearing only the static of her world collapsing. A sound I'd crafted, note by note, with every lie I'd fed them both. Morning light sliced through the blinds, catching Lila slouched at the table, coffee mug trembling in her hands. She hadn't slept, dark circles carved hollows under her eyes, her hair still wild from the night before. "Evan, we need to talk," she said, voice brittle, like glass about to shatter. I sat across from her, sipping my own coffee, calm as a station locked in crystal clear. "What's up?" I asked, though I knew every beat of this mess. She spilled it all. Ricky had cut her off. His last text a furious, "You're done." The bank had called, grilling her about unauthorized transfers she couldn't explain. Then the mail thudded through the slot. A legal notice, stark white, accusing her of fraud, listing dates and amounts tied to Ricky's productions. She shoved it toward me, hands shaking. "I don't know how this happened. Help me fix it." Fix it? I nearly laughed, the sound catching in my throat like static on a bad tube. I'd spent my life fixing things. Cars that coughed, radios that hissed, even her when she'd spiraled after losing her job, crying on the couch while I worked doubles. She'd mocked my hobbies, called my radios junk. But I'd kept at it, finding peace in the hum of a signal coming alive. Now she wanted me to patch this? Her mess? Her betrayal? But then I saw my opening, the dial clicking into place. "I know what you did," I said, voice low, steady. She blinked, head tilting. "What?" I leaned in, locking eyes. "Ricky, the photos, our money, all of it." Her face drained white, mouth gaping, a fish flopping on dry land. I pulled out my phone, thumbed to the recording, and hit play. Her voice filled the room. "I'm making it happen." Smug and clear, bragging about her scheme. She flinched, hands flying to her mouth. But I didn't stop. "You've been lying for months," I said, voice cutting through her silence. "Posing him like some action figure, draining us dry for his ego. I saw you in the garage, Lila. I followed you to that motel." "I know," she stammered. "It wasn't like that, Evan, I swear." But I stood, towering over her. "It's over. You picked him over me, and now you've got nothing." Therefore, I turned, leaving her frozen, and walked to the garage. I didn't need her excuses. I'd already turned her signal to noise, and the broadcast was about to cut out for good. Ricky's comeback hit the next night. A pathetic setup in a community center, folding chairs scattered across a scuffed floor. I didn't need to. I'd rigged the game too well. My phone buzzed with forum updates. Barely 20 people showed, half there to jeer. The reporter had dropped her story, Titans fall, washed-up wrestler duped by obsessed fan, and pinned it square on Lila. Someone posted grainy footage of their parking lot fight, Ricky's voice booming, "You're a liar," while she begged, tripping over her tripod. By morning, his tour was dead. Sponsors bailed. Venues canceled. Fans turned on him like dogs on a wounded stray. Lila's name was everywhere. A punchline now, her friends ghosting her. Her sister leaving voicemails she wouldn't return. I spent the day moving my life out. Tools, radios, clothes, loading them into my truck while she sat inside, staring at the walls. The garage was mine again. Stripped of her junk, just my workbench and the hum of possibility. She didn't notice until I was at the door, duffel slung over my shoulder. "Where are you going?" she croaked, voice raw. "Out," I said, and stepped into the dusk. But I wasn't done twisting the knife. Days back, I'd sent Ricky a final lie through a burner email. "She's got dirt on you?" Old assault charges, fake but convincing. "Watch your back." I'd forged a blurry court doc in Photoshop, just real enough to spook him. He'd believe it. Paranoia was his fuel now, and he'd spend years looking over his shoulder, thinking she held the blade. I drove to a buddy's place, an hour out of town. My new account flush with what I'd salvaged. $3,000 I'd clawed back before the bank locked it down. The rest was gone, swallowed by her obsession, but I didn't care. Therefore, I unloaded my tools into his spare garage, the radio in my truck humming a clear station. No static, just the clean sound of victory. She was broke, alone, drowning in the wreckage she'd built, and I'd walked away clean, the signal finally mine to control. A month later, I was holed up in a rented garage apartment, the air thick with solder and dust. My workbench was a mess. Tubes, wires, a '63 Philco radio I'd snagged at a flea market, its cracked case hiding guts I could still save. The TV flickered in the corner, local news droning. Woman faces fraud charges after failed wrestling scam. Lila's mugshot popped up. Hollow eyes, no fight left, her hair flat against her skull. The anchor rattled off details. Thousands unaccounted for. A delusional scheme to prop up a has-been. Ricky had vanished. Last seen bailing on a bar gig, chased by rumors I'd planted about a fake criminal past. I'd made sure they'd never trust each other again. Each convinced the other held a loaded gun. It was cruel, yeah, but they'd forged this disaster. I just turned the key. I twisted a knob on the Philco, coaxing a faint station through the hiss. Some old crooner my granddad loved, the kind he'd play while puffing his pipe, telling me stories of fixing engines in the 50s. A man's worth is in his hands, he'd say, tapping my skinny arms. I'd learned that lesson well, piecing together radios, cars, a life, until Lila tore it apart. She'd chased a ghost of glory, dragging me with her, thinking I'd stay the quiet fool tinkering in the background. But I'd flipped the script, tuned her signal to static, and watched it fade. The bank had settled. Most of our savings were lost, eaten by her transfers, but I'd kept enough to start over, a few grand to build from scratch. I leaned back, the Philco singing clear now, no crackle, just a smooth hum. The news cut to a clip of Lila leaving court, head down, reporters shouting questions she couldn't answer. I didn't feel sorry, not after the garage, the Polaroids, the lies. Therefore, I set the soldering iron down, the room quiet except for that radio, and felt peace settle in. No static, no betrayal. Just me, my tools, and the sound of her world burning out. A signal lost to the ether while mine played on, steady and strong.